This is Fandom Future circa 2026. Not that far at all. We're just right around the corner, really. Some say that the spirit of Bill Gaines is with us. And sometimes, whenever the radiation is just right in the atmosphere, you can see him. You can see him in the clouds. Do you see him? Yeah, so what we're going to do is kind of take it way back. Pillar of Garbage, if you have not seen his Russia, YouTube, and You video, you fucking need to. The handful of videos that make up his web of grifter media kind of series, starting with Woke X-Men.
Pick one seemingly discrete unit of anti-woke outrage and look further and further into who's behind it, what it's actually claiming, and see that 9 times out of 10, it is just bullshit all the way down.
And then followed up with Across the Grifterverse, and then finally, or at least for now, Beyond the Grifterverse, which is the one about Russia and it is important. But the point being is that that's where we're at. We're caught up. We're caught up on the whole timeline of the grift, right? The culture war grift. Thanks to Pillar of Garbage, which, I guess technically kind of me, like, thanks to me.
I'd like to say a big thank you to the guys over at the Fandom Initiative for pointing me in the right direction with some of this video's research, especially Nothing But Media and actual fandom.
Because, yeah, he totally fucking based a couple of those videos off of stuff that, work that we had done in the initiative.
I'm just going to cite a video by Actual Fandom digging into the story of this channel, which is, of course, linked below, and mention the way it seems to have been established after an Alex Jones Friday Night Tights guest spot.
He can have that. He can have it. I'm not jealous. Because it doesn't matter who fucking came up with it, honestly. It matters that it's out there, and it matters that people are learning about it. But that leaves another direction that's not as explored as you might think. On this channel, we've talked about Gamergate, we've talked about Comicsgate, we've talked about, hell, if you watch the Fatcast, we've talked about conservative, reactionary bullshit going back to the Cathars or something, I don't know. We haven't talked about literally where the very seeds of this version of the culture war began. And why do I say this version of the culture war? Because culture war is something that has been around conceptually for a while. So we're going to run through the history of that real quick. The culture wars. What does that mean? Identity, including race, sexual orientation, gender, have become lightning rod subjects of hundreds of bills and state legislatures across the country as Americans across the political spectrum seek to define the nation's values. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about a culture war. Outside of fandom, because it's easy to think of it as just being a part of fandom, and really that's kind of part of the function of it, is to be kind of vague, like a lot of things that reactionaries do. It's just vague by nature. The term doesn't really define something that you can just point to and go, that's the thing, that's it. It's multiple things. It can be shifted and different things thrown under the umbrella. And, I presume that's by design. Nonetheless, debate over these issues intensifying as we're, 45 days out from the 2024 election. But how did identity openly become one of the leading narratives for conservative politicians on the campaign trail? Well, because it wasn't always like that. They used to actually talk about like policies about like fucking the economy and yeah, there's some of that thankfully being forced back into the conversation because you got Kamala Harris and Tim Walz doing their part. But if it was up to the Republicans, the right, MAGA, we would never talk about policies. Not anything factual anyway. They would just go, oh, we're going to cut taxes. They're doing it now. We're going to cut taxes for everybody. And then they cut taxes for fucking billionaires. And it's like, see, we cut taxes for you. And then, the fucking poor people in middle class, what's left of it, they're like, oh, thank you, Mr. President, for cutting taxes for us. My life is really hard right now, but I feel like I won. Anyway. So when the culture wars in the United States first started is arguable. Christopher Sebastian Parker, a professor of political science at the University of Washington, Seattle, considers the backlash to the abolition of slavery as an early contextualization about how we got to the culture wars we're seeing today. So let's think about that for a second. The abolition of slavery being the kind of like the first hints of what would become the culture war. Why is that? Is there something there? Is there something there that we can point to that's like kind of a connective thread? Like, why would people start feeling like there was a culture war when slavery was abolished? And how does that relate to anything today with, like, people saying that they don't like woke stuff, as in like people of color in their movies or whatever? Like, you get it. You get it. It's fucking racism, man. It's fucking right there in the spine of the whole thing. As Americans grappled with how to integrate formerly enslaved Black Americans into society, white supremacists in the South called for redemption, the removal of rights for Black Americans. But the culture wars as we know it begins in the 1960s. Well, okay, there's nothing going on in the 60s that had something to do with race, though, right? Oh, no. Yeah, there was. Totally was. Yeah. Which were rife with movements for liberation and change, according to historians. I mean, I don't think you don't need a historian to tell you that a lot of social movements were happening in the 60s, I don't think. Marginalized groups in the civil rights, Black Power, Chicano, feminist, and gay rights movements were demanding equal rights and challenging the quote-unquote normative American culture of the 50s that had begun to solidify, according to historians and author Andrew Hartman. The upheaval of traditional American values was met with anger and backlash. What? That's crazy. Particularly from the Christian and religious right, who began feeling like the nation itself no longer represented them or their values. And it's weird that allowing people to have freedom, even though it's not that they're not going to exercise it the same way that you do, that somehow infringes on your freedom, and we just see that still today. It's the same shit. Same old shit, man. You get these sort of two coalescing movements that are polarizing the national culture. By the 1980s, and especially the 90s, you get what's called the culture wars. In the 1980s, the Republican Party grew increasingly aligned with religious conservatives, noticing that Reagan could gain a lot of electoral traction by speaking about issues that matter to the Christian right, to evangelicals. So yeah, we've talked about this on the old Fapcast not too long ago, where Reagan very consciously, knowingly, some might say cynically, kind of just leaned into the religious right, even though that wasn't really something that he was, as invested in. The remnants of this shift remain in the GOP and conservative movements today. So the things that we now associate with Republicans in terms of their anti-trans, anti-critical race theory, the culture wars they're fighting right now, you see all of this even during the Reagan years. And this stuff was kind of like the backdrop of politics more, before the last decade or two. Politics were still being discussed as far as like first and foremost, generally. There would be like something would flare up or something. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying this is a bad thing that's talked about now. Don't get me wrong. It's good that these things are at the forefront now. It's just that the way that they are often pushed to the forefront is by these culture warriors, these fucking conservative dickheads that, they get out ahead of everything and they frame things in these really shitty ways, these really anti-human ways, anti-social ways, hateful ways. That's essentially what the culture war is, in my opinion. And this is, like I said, it's a kind of amorphous concept that can't really be pinned down 100%. But I think that in the same way that, like, whenever Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And immediately people were like, there's a war, the war in Ukraine. And I'm like, man, it feels weird to call it a war, because I feel like, to me, in my mind, a war is like, let's go to war. We're agreeing to go to war, right? I know that's kind of silly, but Ukraine is just like, hey, man, fucking get out of Ukraine. What are you doing? What are you doing, Putin? What's going on here? It's like a war was being waged at Ukraine. So yeah, it's a war, but it just still feels weird to call it a war. Like, it legitimizes, it just feels like it legitimizes it somehow to me. And it's the same thing here. It's like, calling this a culture war is like, it's not honest, because it's not a war. If these things were left to their own devices, they would generally continue to, things would become more socially progressive. That's just what happens by, I'm not going to say naturally, but like by, by default. If there's not people pushing against it, then generally people are going to become more empathetic, more compassionate, more understanding of other people's lived experiences and identities and whatever else. You have to have someone that's forcibly intentionally making a fucking stink over things. We've talked about this. I mean, you can see it right now with the Russia indictments. That's just the most recent example of some entity that has decided to light the fire under these hot button issues and make them even hotter, and to like then throw grease on that fire and make it a fucking grease fire. And you've had libertarian, Republican, GOP think tanks for, especially since Citizens United, but even before then, they were finding ways to inflame these conversations, by putting people like Rush Limbaugh, fucking Glenn Beck, fucking Eric July, these types of people. The reason that they're constantly saying incendiary things is because that's what they're supposed to do. It's their job. It's they're supposed to do that and get people riled up, get the Republicans generally, even not just Republicans, they're trying to mobilize people who are less politically, concerned, to be concerned about these transes and stuff like that. It's just not it's not an organic thing, but it is a backlash. It's backlash by rich white people. Exactly. It's not inevitable, but I mean, there's definitely some forced adversity happening. Okay. You know what? That's what the culture war is, guys. That's what it is. The culture war is forced adversity.
The only way that you can really stop this kind of thing is to arouse public opinion. It's very upsetting. It has a bad moral effect. Forced adversity.
When I was a kid, it was too much supper. Now it's comic books.
I'll burn them tomorrow.
Bad, B-A-D-D, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons.
Ask yourself, what's more terrifying, fear or the frightened?
I think there ought to be a law against them. Tonight I'm going to show you why.